The streets of Brooklyn were eerily quiet, the cold night air thick with fog as it curled around the dim streetlights. Among the shadows moved a lone figure shadow, an aging stray dog whose once bright copper fur had faded with time. He limped slightly, his body bearing the marks of years spent surviving on the streets. To the locals, he was a familiar presence, a silent observer of the city's rhythms, earning scraps and occasional kindness from shopkeepers and children alike. But tonight, something felt different. A faint sound broke through the silence, a soft, fragile cry carried by the wind. Shadow froze, his ears perking up. It wasn't the usual rustling of rodents or the distant wail of a siren. This sound was different, it was desperate. Cautiously, he followed the noise, his worn paws pressing against the damp pavement as he made his way deeper into the alley. The cry grew louder, pulling him toward a rusted trash can beside a row of overflowing dumpsters. He sniffed at the base of the can, whimpering as the scent of something unfamiliar, yet unmistakably human reached him. Pouring at the container, he nudged the lid, causing it to tip over with a metallic clang. Inside, wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket, was a tiny baby. Her face was pale, her lips trembling, her breaths weak and uneven. Shadow hesitated for only a moment before nudging her gently with his nose. The child stirred slightly, letting out another feeble cry. Without a second thought, Shadow reached down and carefully grasped the bundle between his teeth. He knew he had to move fast. The journey was slow and difficult, his old legs straining under the weight of the child. The street stretched endlessly ahead, but he pressed on, driven by something deeper than instinct. The small cottage at the edge of town was the only place he could think of a home where kindness lived. Inside, Grace sat in her cozy living room, adjusting her glasses as she sipped a cup of tea. The peaceful silence was interrupted by a faint scratching at the door. Expecting to see Shadow begging for food, she rose to open it. But when she looked down, her breath caught in her throat. There, at her feet, Shadow stood trembling, his tired eyes pleading, and in his mouth, wrapped in fabric, was a baby. "Oh my God," she whispered, dropping to her knees. Carefully, she reached out, her hands shaking as she took the child from Shadow's gentle grip. The baby's skin was ice cold, her tiny chest barely rising and falling. "What have you done, boy?" Grace murmured, tears welling in her eyes. She pressed a hand against the baby's cheek, feeling for warmth. There was barely any. Her instincts kicked in. Wrapping the baby tighter, she whispered, "We need to get you to the hospital now." She scooped the infant into her arms and turned back to Shadow. His frail body was shaking, exhaustion weighing him down. "You brave, brave soul," she whispered before rushing out the door. The emergency room at Brooklyn General was a flurry of movement and fluorescent lights. Grace burst through the entrance, the child cradled tightly against her chest. "Please," she called, her voice urgent, "she needs help." A nurse turned, eyes widening at the sight of the frail bundle. "We need a doctor in here now," she shouted, motioning for an orderly to bring a wheelchair. As Grace sank into the seat, she gazed down at the tiny girl in her arms. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "You're safe now." In that moment, a name surfaced in her mind: Victoria. A doctor soon arrived, his face worn with years of experience but kind. Dr. Morgan examined the baby carefully, pressing his fingers lightly against her chest. His expression darkened. "She has a congenital heart defect," he murmured. "She needs immediate surgery." Grace's heart pounded. "Can you save her?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Morgan hesitated. A shadow passed over his features, a memory of another child, another surgery, one that had ended in failure. His hands clenched at the thought, the weight of that loss pressing down on him. Grace, sensing his hesitation, reached for his hand. "This baby was saved by a stray dog," she said, her voice filled with quiet urgency. "If a dog could risk everything for her, shouldn't we?" Dr. Morgan exhaled slowly. The image of Shadow flashed in his mind, the old dog, worn and tired, yet carrying this child through the freezing night. Something about that unwavering determination struck him deep. He nodded. "I'll do it." The operating room was tense, the beeping of monitors filling the air. Dr. Morgan worked with precision, his hands steady despite the memories clawing at the edges of his mind. But suddenly, the monitor's steady rhythm faltered. The baby's heartbeat dropped. A nurse gasped, "We're losing her." Panic threatened to consume him. "Not again." Then, a voice soft but firm. "You can do this, Doctor." Dr. Morgan inhaled sharply, forcing himself to focus. His hands moved swiftly, correcting the issue, his heart pounding as he watched the monitor. Then, a steady beep, a heartbeat. A long, quiet exhale filled the room. She had made it. Hours later, Grace sat beside Victoria's hospital bed, Shadow curled up at her feet. Dr. Morgan entered, his face lighter, relieved. "She's going to be okay," he said softly. Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she bent down to stroke Shadow's fur. "You saved her," she whispered. "You saved us all." Dr. Morgan looked at the dog, his voice filled with something almost reverent. "No, he did." As dawn broke over the city, the golden light streaming through the hospital windows, Shadow finally closed his eyes, not from exhaustion but from peace. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just a stray, he was a hero.